Many Lifetimes, a book about reincarnation, by Kelsey and Joan Grant. Chapter 6, Reincarnation and Psychotherapy. And this chapter is written by Kelsey. I have always been appalled by the length of time an orthodox psychoanalysis was presumed to require. And one appeal of hypnosis had been that with its aid, a radical form of therapy could be accomplished far more quickly. I completely accepted Joan's concept of the vastly increased time scale during which the events responsible for a patient's illness might have occurred, and I found it extremely exciting. But I was apprehensive that the task of searching for the essential experience in this virtually limitless area might be endless. Joan assured me that she was well aware that some patients would seize on the notion of reincarnation as a new as a new avenue of escape, but she felt confident of being able to discriminate between a genuine recall from an earlier lifetime and an alleged memory, which in fact was only a fantasy in fancy dress. She emphasized that in the majority of cases, the cause of the neurosis would lie in events of the current lifetime, and that only when fragments of an earlier personality had failed to integrate would the proposed extension of my usual regression technique become apposite. We had scarcely established ourselves in London when two such cases occurred in quick succession. They were particularly impressive to me because each was a former patient of whom, long before I had even heard of Joan, I had carried out an extensive hypnoanalysis which had been only partially successful. The first was a young woman with an obsessional neurosis. The first was a young man with an obsessive neurosis. His most prominent symptom was the unshakable idea that an action he had performed when a boy of 7 was responsible for the arthritis, which his father developed some 13 years later. This incident had happened when his parents, who had been away for a few days, were due to return, and his nanny had asked him to help her to make their bed. She had gone to fetch the sheets when it occurred to him to run a damp flannel over the mattress, a task that he completed before she re-entered the room. He knew that to associate this incident with his father's illness was completely illogical, but this in no way diminished his feelings of guilt and anxiety, and, as so frequently happens in this obsessional type of illness, the mechanism responsible for his principal symptom had spread to various other aspects of his emotional life and created a number of subsidiary problems. The analysis went into many ramifications, which it is unnecessary to consider here, but I must mention certain factors which concern the central symptom. According to a theory which at the time I considered basic, every small boy goes through a phase of feeling violently hostile towards his father. If this hostility, instead of being resolved, is relegated to the child's unconscious, it may later be the source of a wide variety of neurotic feelings. I assumed that this was what had happened in this case, and when I learned during an early session it was axiomatic in this family that to sleep in a damp bed meant catching your death of cold, or resulted in rheumatism. I felt sure that in running a damp flannel over the mattress, the child had been acting out an unconscious wish to kill his father. I no longer believed that it is natural for small boys to go through this hostile phase, but this patient had undoubtedly done so. To his astonishment and dismay, he found a plethora of such feelings and a number of acts through which they had found symbolic expression. But to my surprise, the damp flannel episode did not appear to come under this heading. Though I returned to the point repeatedly and the patient appreciated how apt an explanation it would be, it had no effect on his obsession. After about 80 sessions, it became clear that we were making no further progress. So we mutually agreed to discontinue the analysis. I heard from him occasionally, so I knew that his symptoms waned and waxed, but were not preventing him from making excellent progress in his career. I had had no news of him for 2 years, when a letter arrived asking for an appointment as soon as possible. He wrote that a few months previously his father had died of a stroke. This event had caused no exacerbation of my patient's symptoms until he had chanced upon an article in a magazine which mentioned that if rats were exposed for long enough to cold and damp, they suffered a rise in blood pressure. This information had sparked off a chain of ideas: cold, damp, high blood pressure, stroke, and now he felt that not only his father's arthritis, but his death was inexorably linked to the episode of the damp mattress. When he arrived, I gave him a brief resume of my reasons for believing that the origin of his symptoms might lie in an earlier lifetime. He found the theory acceptable and readily agreed that Joan should be present during the session. Within minutes of reaching deep hypnosis, he said, "I can see a young woman in Edwardian dress. She is wearing a wide-brimmed hat, tied on with a veil. She is standing on the steps outside the front door, waiting to be taken out in a motor car, which she is hoping to see come up the drive leading to the house. It is a large mansion." At this point, Joan passed me the notebook by which she communicates with me during a session, as even a low whisper can be disturbing to the patient. I read, "Valid memory, I can see it too, but not a mansion, an ordinary late Victorian house. Ask him how many windows." I did so. He replied, "There are 2 on each side of the front door, which has 4 steps leading up to it. There are 5 windows in the upper story." And then he added, "I can see the drive clearly now. It's only a gravel sweep round a shrubbery of laurels." During the next hour, the story gradually unfolded. The young woman had been orphaned during her early teens, when her parents died during a cholera epidemic in India. My father was in the army, and my mother had always been delicate. She had been sent back to England to live with her aunt, her mother's elder sister. The house was on the outskirts of a country town, which the patient thought was in East Anglia, but he could not remember the name of it. She imagined herself to be financially independent. No, she imagined herself to be financially dependent on her aunt until recently. At the age of 21, she'd been told by a lawyer that her parents had left her a substantial trust fund. Until she married, the interest was controlled by the aunt, but on her marriage, the capital would become her own, providing, and this was the crux of the problem, that the marriage took place with the aunt's consent. If she married someone considered undesirable, she would not get a penny of it. The patient became increasingly emotional as he described how the girl hoped to marry the curate, whom the aunt did not consider a suitable match. Perhaps the curate was too timid or too avaricious to agree to an elopement, but it became obvious that the girl was becoming desperate with the fear of losing him. At this stage, Joan handed me another note. Tell him to see his aunt's bedroom. He soon began to describe a room which was obviously the lair of a professional invalid. It is intolerably stuffy. She has been burning one of her medicated cones, and she never permits a window to be opened. There are medicine bottles and pill boxes everywhere. And another note from Joan said, ask what the aunt is doing. The immediate response to this question was, she is having a bath. It has mahogany sides, and there is a step up to it. I asked him what he was doing, and he replied, I am making her bed while she is in the bath. I do not get the sheets from the airing cupboard. I do not get the sheets from the airing cupboard. I bring them from the clothesline in the garden. At this point, Joan, unseen by the patient, whose eyes remained closed while under hypnosis, made the gesture of dipping her hand in water and flicking the drops from her fingers. But before I could ask him for further details, he continued, the sheets are damp, but not damp enough. I go to the washstand and fetch the ewer and flick water over the mattress. But the aunt came back from the bathroom too soon. She not only saw what the girl was doing, but understood why she was doing it. And she screamed, you want me to catch my death of cold. And she fell into such a frenzy of rage that she had a stroke. From this, she remained bedridden for many years, nursed by the girl who dared not leave her because the aunt now had the additional weapon of the threat to expose the attempt at murder. When I brought the patient slowly back to the present day and out of hypnosis, he had a clear memory of all that he'd been telling us, and he felt no doubt at all that it was part of his own long history. He was completely satisfied that at last he had discovered the true source of his guilt, a guilt which had become transferred to his father. When I wrote to him for permission to quote from his case study, he confirmed that this symptom had never recurred after the session. The second of these two cases arrived a few days later. The patient was a tall, wiry, athletic young man who suffered from the idea that there was something feminine about the shape of his hips. This idea was associated with feelings of guilt and inferiority so intense that he had been unable to concentrate on training for a career and was ill at ease with both men and women. The knowledge that both the idea and the feelings were completely irrational was of no help to him whatever. He was an unusually good hypnotic subject, and I am satisfied that during the course of a long analysis I did not overlook any factor in his present life which might have been the origin of his symptoms. I managed to help him to the extent that he was able to derive considerable enjoyment from social activities and also to complete an arduous training for a profession, but I knew that I had failed to solve his essential problem. After we had discontinued the analysis, he used to visit me perhaps once a year, but socially rather than professionally. I had not seen him for an unusually long time when he wrote me asking for an appointment because his symptoms were again troubling him severely. He was sympathetic to my new ideas and was obviously pleased that Joan was also going to try to help him. I induced hypnosis, and I told him to let his mind wander in search of the origin of his feelings, stressing that he would have no hesitation about expressing anything, even though it seemed improbable or bizarre. Within a few minutes, he began to describe scenes in which an elegant young woman appeared, always with a handsome escort. But the scenes changed abruptly. Swathed in white ermine, she was alighting from a Daimler at the entrance to the Savoy, and then, without any thread of continuity, she was on the deck of a large yacht, and then in the paddock at Ascot. Joan handed me a note. This is a genuine recall, but he is not seeing the girl he really was. These are the girl's daydreams of the woman that she longed to be. Tell him to see the girl herself. He quickly identified with her, using the present tense and becoming increasingly distressed as the story progressed. She had been the daughter of a small tradesman in a university town and had fallen in love with a titled undergraduate. She believed he intended to marry her, and her fantasies were of the life that she expected to lead as his wife, a role for which she tried to equip herself by poring over fashion magazines and society papers. But when she told him that she thought she might be pregnant, he was too scared even to be sympathetic, and said he never wished to see her again. She resorted to purging, excessively hot baths, and to jumping from a 5-foot wall, but none of these devices had the desired effect. She laced herself into a strong corset, in anguished apprehension of the day when her remorselessly swelling abdomen must betray her condition to her parents. At 5 months, in desperation, she sought an abortion at unskilled hands. Many of the grisly details were described. The operation took place in the kitchen of a squalid little house and was performed by an old woman who presumably panicked or fled in search of help when she realized that something had gone seriously wrong. The girl died, still strapped down on the table, listening to her blood dripping on the stone floor as she became increasingly cold, increasingly terrified. It was the circumstances of this death alone and in fear which caused the element of her personality to become split off and frozen in a timeless present. The integrated components reincarnated within 2 years, but in a male body. Had this body been female, my patient might have suffered from an irrational fear of childbirth or from phantom pregnancies. It is a tribute to his basic stability that, although he was in effect being haunted by his own ghost, its appeal for integration was translated only as, quote, a feeling that there was something feminine, something shameful about the shape of my hips, end quote. The other aspect of this case, which to me was of special interest, was that the fantasies which were seen both by the patient and by Joan during the initial phase of the session had appeared during the earlier hypnoanalysis. I had felt these scenes to be important, and I had urged him to enlarge upon them, but he had been unable to do so. I had offered various interpretations, including the possibility that the elegant woman represented the person he unconsciously wished to be. He could reply only that none of these interpretations felt valid, and that there was no trace of the indignation which often indicates that his suggestion is correct, but has been offered prematurely. In retrospect, this is not surprising, since he and I were thinking in terms of only a single lifetime. When discussing the case with Joan, I asked her how she had recognized that these were fantasies. Although highly relevant, they were not memories of actual events. She explained that the clue lay in the fact that they were static and they contained no action. This was because the girl was able to visualize how she would appear, but not what she would do, in situations which were outside her social experience. Had she belonged to the same milieu as the man she hoped to marry, she would have seen herself playing an active part in her daydreams, in which case their true nature would have been more difficult to discern. The fantasies had persisted because the girl had directed such a large portion of her energies into her hopes for the future, and then into her apprehensions of what would ensue if her pregnancy were discovered. It was this disproportionate quota of energy which had caused the fantasies to become condensed into constructs, having an independent existence of their own, on the wish-fear level of reality. If they had been only etherical, they would not have been perceptible to anyone else. Had I followed the thread of the fantasies, which was offered to me during the hypnoanalysis, I might have unraveled this patient's problem very much sooner, but I could not do so because it led me beyond the limits of a single lifetime, which then circumscribed my approach to psychiatry. But when I no longer tried to fit the relevant material into too small a framework, his symptoms, with Joan's help, were cured in a single session. I think the word cured is justified, for he has had no recurrence of the symptoms during 8 years, and he is very happily married. The two cases which I have just described belong to a group of neuroses, which are caused by fragments of the personality having become dissociated. The contribution of reincarnation is the recognition that such fragments sometimes derive from an earlier personality. But a far more common cause of neurosis is a defect in character. In cases of this type, the effect of reincarnation, perhaps surprisingly, let me start the sentence again. In cases of this type, the effect of reincarnation, perhaps surprisingly, has been to focus my attention less upon the patient's past than upon his present. The key to this change of emphasis, although I then did not realize it, had been offered to me in the different reactions displayed by patients when regressed to intrauterine life. For example, some reacted to sensations of discomfort by an aggressive desire to retaliate, others by trying to make themselves inconspicuous in the hope of escaping from further attack. I had also noted that the patient's approach to life when adult was essentially similar to that which he had revealed while still a fetus. Let me read that sentence again because that seems important. I had also noted that the patient's approach to life when adult was essentially similar to that which he had revealed while still a fetus. But until I had widened the range of my concepts, I did not realize the essential point, that an individual incarnates with the character he has acquired during the course of his long history, and moreover, the character is neither inherited nor molded by the pressures of the environment, but is formed only by the exercise of the individual's power of choice. Outside pressures can cause a person to change his behavior, but only he himself can change his intentions. This principle is now the basis of my approach to the neurosis, which is due to a character defect, an apparently fixed tendency to repeat a choice, which is unhealthy. Because I've become convinced that no matter how long a person may have had such a tendency, nor under what circumstances it was originally formed, he can begin to change it at any moment that he decides to do so. The criterion as to whether a particular reaction is healthy or unhealthy derives from the undeniable fact that, with the possible exception of acute pain, the one situation which a human being finds intolerable is loneliness, the feeling that there is no one who is other than indifferent to the fact of his existence. And every action or reaction in respect of another person must either be heading away from loneliness or towards it. For it is to indifference that love will turn if it is not nourished, and to which even hate will eventually cool. The effect of reincarnation is to underline the force of the word eventually. For the end of a lifetime is not necessarily the end of a tendency to a particular type of reaction. The time must come when the approach of loneliness, on account of unhealthy traits, engenders a degree of anxiety which manifests itself as one or another of a wide variety of neurotic symptoms. But if the patient can be shown that the aspects of his character which are threatening him with loneliness and can form the wholehearted wish to change them, then the change will begin and the symptoms will start to recede.